April 1945. A converted schoolhouse in southern Bavaria. The smell of disinfectant hangs heavy in the corridor, mixed with the faint tang of carbolic soap and something else the German women could not name. 23 of them stand in a line along a whitewashed wall, still in the gray-green uniforms of the Luftwaffe Helferinnen, the female auxiliaries who had operated radios, manned searchlights, and pushed counters across map tables in command bunkers across a collapsing Reich. Their boots are caked in mud from a 4-day march. Their hair has not been washed in weeks. Some are barely 19 years old, and an American medical officer, a woman in a crisp olive uniform with captain's bars on her collar, walks the length of the line with a clipboard in her hand and says something through an interpreter that makes every German woman in that hallway feel her stomach turn to ice. You will each remove your clothing. You will each be examined. You will spread your legs for the doctor. This is required. This will happen today. Greta Hoffmann, 22 years old, a radio operator from Dresden, feels her knees nearly give out beneath her. She has been warned about this moment since she first put on the uniform. Nazi radio had told them. Officers had told them. Even her own mother had told her before she left Dresden, before Dresden was a smoking grave. The Americans would do this. The Americans would shame them. The Americans would treat them like cattle. And now here it was. The corridor, the doctor, the order, the end of dignity. Except that nothing, absolutely nothing, that happened in the next 2 hours would resemble what Greta had been prepared to endure. And what those American doctors did next would haunt her, but not in the way she expected, not in the way anyone in that hallway expected. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what you are about to hear has been buried in declassified medical reports for almost 80 years, and it changes everything you thought you knew about the final months of the war. If you find untold history like this worth preserving, hit that subscribe button right now, tap the bell so YouTube tells you the moment the next story drops, and leave a like to help this video reach the people who need to hear it. Now let me take you back to how Greta Hoffmann ended up in that hallway in the first place, because to understand the shock of what happened, you have to understand the terror she carried into that room. To find Greta in April 1945, you have to go back 5 months earlier, to a snow-buried bunker outside the town of Wesel, where a girl who had grown up under a regime that promised her a 1,000-year empire was watching that empire die one radio transmission at a time. She had volunteered in the spring of 1943, when she was 19 years old. Her brother had been killed in the east, somewhere near a town she could not pronounce, and her father had pinned a black ribbon to the door of their small apartment on Bautzner Strasse and told her that the family would now serve in whatever way it could. Greta did not want to fight, and women were not supposed to fight, but the Luftwaffe needed radio operators desperately, and the Helferinnen program was expanding by the month. By the end of 1944, almost 500,000 German women had been pulled into auxiliary military service. Some were anti-aircraft gunners, called Flakhelferinnen, who tracked Allied bombers across the night sky. Some were nurses in field hospitals that smelled of gangrene and crushed antiseptic ampules. Some were clerks, typists, drivers, switchboard operators. Greta was a Nachrichtenhelferin, a signals auxiliary, trained for 6 weeks at a school outside Berlin, and then shipped west to a Luftwaffe command station near the Dutch border. For almost 2 years, she sat in dim rooms wearing oversized headphones, copying down Morse traffic, routing messages between fighter squadrons and ground control, watching the war shrink in on her one map pin at a time. She slept in barracks with 12 other girls. She drank thin ersatz coffee made from roasted barley. She ate margarine on bread that grew darker and more bitter as the war ground on, until by the winter of 1944, the bread was the color of wet earth, and she sometimes had to pick small splinters of wood out of her teeth after eating it. And through all of it, the political officers came to her station every 2 weeks to remind her, in voices that admitted no doubt, What would happen if the Americans or the British ever broke through? The Americans were animals. The Americans were criminals released from prison to fight. The Americans were not really Americans at all, but a mongrel mob of races commanded by Jews who wanted revenge on the German people. The British were starving cannibals. The Soviets were beasts who would do unspeakable things to any German woman they captured. But the Americans, the political officers said, were perhaps the worst, because the Americans pretended to be civilized while they planned exactly the same horrors. If you are captured, the officers said, expect to be stripped naked in front of soldiers. Expect to be photographed in shameful positions for their propaganda. Expect to be examined in ways that no decent woman should ever experience. Expect rape, the officers said calmly, in the same tone they used to describe the weather. Expect to be passed from soldier to soldier until you are broken. Expect that if you survive at all, you will return to Germany unfit to be a wife, unfit to be a mother, marked forever as a woman who has been used. Save the last bullet for yourself, they said, or take poison, or jump. Whatever you do, do not let yourself be taken alive. Greta listened to these lectures sitting on a wooden bench with her hands folded in her lap, and she believed every word. Why would she not believe? She had grown up inside the regime. She had never known anything else. Her school books had taught her that other peoples were lesser. Her radio programs had told her that the war was a defense of European civilization against barbarism. And now the barbarians were coming. So when the front collapsed in late March 1945, and her unit was ordered to evacuate east, and the trucks broke down on a road outside Wesel because there was no fuel, and her sergeant told her that the Americans were less than 10 kilometers away and closing fast, Greta did exactly what she had been trained to do. She destroyed her code books. She smashed her radio crystals under the heel of her boot. She removed the small swastika pin from her tunic and buried it in the snow. And then she sat down on a fallen log at the edge of a stand of pine trees and waited for the end of the world to arrive in the shape of a man with an American flag on his shoulder. It did not arrive the way she had imagined. The Americans came on foot, not in tanks. They were tired. They were filthy. They were unshaven and red-eyed, and they smelled of cigarettes and motor oil and old sweat. There were 6 of them, and they were led by a sergeant who could not have been older than 25, with a thick stubble of beard and eyes that had seen far too much for his age. He pointed his rifle at her, and she raised her hands, and she waited for him to say something terrible or do something terrible, and instead he just looked at her, very tired, and said in slow, careful schoolbook German, "Sind Sie Soldat? Are you a soldier?" She nodded. He nodded back. He gestured for her to stand. He motioned to one of his men, a boy with a freckled face who could not have been more than 19, and said something in English that Greta did not understand. The boy approached her warily, took her by the arm, and steered her toward a small group of other German women who had been gathered at the side of the road. None of the women had been struck. None had been searched roughly. None had been touched in any way that resembled what Greta had been told to expect. The sergeant walked along the line and counted them, 17, 18, 19. He wrote the number in a small notebook with a pencil stub. He passed out cigarettes from a crumpled pack, and when Greta did not take one because she did not smoke, he shrugged and put the pack back in his pocket. And then they began to walk. They walked for 3 days. The Americans gave them rations, square biscuits called crackers, and a tinned meat product called Spam, and a powdered drink mix that tasted faintly of lemons, and the women ate ravenously and gratefully and with a quiet terror, because the food only made them more sure that something worse was coming. Why would the enemy feed them if not to keep them alive for something terrible? Why would the enemy let them sleep undisturbed at night in the corner of a barn if not because the truly bad things were being saved for later? Greta whispered with the other women in the dark hayloft on the second night, and they all agreed. This was the lull. The horror was being kept in reserve. It would come at the processing center. They had heard rumors of the processing centers, American doctors, American examinations, the full degradation that the political officers had warned them about for 2 years. The food and the cigarettes and the unhurried marches were just preparation, fattening the lamb for the slaughter. By the time they reached the converted schoolhouse in southern Bavaria on the morning of April the 11th, Greta had not slept properly in 4 days. Her hands shook. Her stomach felt as if it had been filled with ice water. And when the American military policeman at the door pointed to the corridor and barked an order in English that an interpreter immediately rendered into precise, courteous German, Greta felt the last small piece of hope inside her go cold and quiet and small. The order was simple. Form a line along the wall. Wait to be called. You will each be medically examined before you are processed into the prisoner of war system. Do not speak. Do not move from your place. This is required. She had heard those last 2 words before. This is required. They were the words the political officers had used. They were the words the regime had used to take her brother and put him in a uniform and send him east to die in a snowfield outside a town she could not pronounce. They were the words a man in authority used when he was about to do something to you that you did not want, and he wanted you to understand in advance that no objection would be heard. So when the American captain, the woman with the clipboard, walked the length of the line and explained through the interpreter that each of them would be required to undress completely, that each of them would be required to allow a physical examination, including an internal gynecological inspection, that each of them would be required to submit blood samples and to permit the cutting of a small amount of hair from the head and the body for laboratory analysis. Greta heard the words and felt nothing at all, because she had already arrived at the place inside herself that she had been building for 2 years, the small stone room with no windows where she would go when the worst finally came. She thought of her mother. She thought of Dresden, and the firestorm in February, and the photographs that had reached the front, blackened bodies fused to the cobblestones of streets she had walked as a child. She thought of her brother. She closed her eyes and waited to be called. The interpreter, a quiet woman in her 40s who, Greta would later learn, had grown up in Munich and emigrated to America in 1936, spoke once more. "I want every woman here to understand something," she said, and her voice was calm and even and slightly tired. "You are about to be examined by qualified medical personnel under the protocols of the United States Army Medical Corps. You will not be harmed. You will not be photographed. You will not be insulted. You will not be touched in any way that is not strictly medical. If you experience pain, you will tell the doctor and the examination will pause. You will be examined by female nurses where possible and by male physicians only when no female physician is available, and in all cases with a female chaperone present in the room. The purpose of this examination is to identify diseases that could spread through the camp population, to identify pregnancies that will require additional care, and to identify medical conditions that have gone untreated during your service. This is the same examination given to American servicewomen at induction. It is the same examination given to female refugees and displaced persons. It is not punishment. It is medicine. Do you understand? Greta did not understand. None of them understood. The words made a kind of grammatical sense, but they did not fit into any model of the world she had been given. She had been told a story for 2 years, and the story had been very clear, and now the story had walked her into a corridor and was telling her that the next room contained not the things she had been promised, but something entirely different. Something that did not exist in any version of reality she had been trained to accept. She thought it must be a trick. She thought the gentle words were the bait, and the trap would close as soon as she stepped through the door. She gripped the hem of her uniform tunic with both hands and waited. The first woman in the line, a 30-year-old former anti-aircraft auxiliary named Ilse Kruger, was called by name. The door at the end of the corridor opened. A woman in a white coat appeared, with a stethoscope around her neck and steel-rimmed spectacles pushed up onto her forehead, and motioned Ilse forward with a small, professional smile. Ilse walked toward her on shaking legs. The door closed behind them. The corridor was silent for almost 40 minutes. Greta counted the seconds in her head because she could not bear to count anything else. And then the door opened again, and Ilse walked out, and she was crying, but not in the way Greta had expected. She was crying the way a person cries when something they have braced themselves to endure has turned out to be something else entirely. She was crying the way a person cries when relief arrives in a place they thought relief had been forbidden. She walked back to her place in line, and another woman, Helga, who had served with her in the same battery for 2 years, whispered something to her in German, asking what had happened, what had they done, was it bad? And Ilse just shook her head and could not speak, and finally she said, in a voice that was hardly a voice at all, "She is a real doctor. She is a real doctor, Helga. She washed her hands. She put on gloves. She was so gentle. She apologized when she had to use the speculum. She apologized." And the entire line of German women along the white-painted wall went absolutely still, because in the world they had come from, no one apologized for anything, and certainly no one in a position of authority apologized to a woman who had been brought into their custody. Apology was a foreign currency. It did not exist in the bank where they had been trained to keep their expectations, and it had just been spent, freely and without fanfare, by an American woman in a white coat behind a closed door in a converted schoolhouse in southern Bavaria. Greta felt something in her chest that she could not identify. It was not relief. It was not yet relief. It was the beginning of the suspicion that maybe, just maybe, the next 2 hours of her life were going to belong to a different story than the one she had been told. When Greta's name was called, she walked through the door and into a room that surprised her in the smallest and most decisive ways. It was clean. It was warm. There was a stove in the corner with the door open, casting an orange glow across a hooked rag rug on the wooden floor. There was an examination table, covered with a clean white sheet. There was a folding screen, painted pale green, behind which she was instructed to undress and place her clothes on a small chair. The doctor was a woman of perhaps 45, with iron-gray hair pulled back into a tight knot, and a face that looked as if it had not smiled often in the last several years, but might once have smiled easily. Her name was Captain Margaret Doyle. She had been a country physician in upstate New York before the war, with a practice that had specialized in obstetrics and pediatrics, and she had volunteered for the Army Medical Corps in the autumn of 1942. By April 1945, she had examined approximately 3,000 women, military and civilian, German and Polish and French and Dutch and Belgian and Russian, in a series of converted buildings across the wreckage of Western Europe. She had developed, by the time Greta walked through her door, a manner that was both efficient and unhurried, and that managed somehow to communicate competence and respect at the same time. She nodded to Greta. She nodded to the older female chaperone, an army nurse named Sergeant Patricia Walsh, who was already standing in the corner of the room with a clipboard. She gestured to the screen and said, in passable but stilted German, "Bitte, ziehen Sie sich aus. Behalten Sie das Hemd an, wenn es Ihnen lieber ist. Please undress. You may keep your undershirt on if you prefer." Greta went behind the screen. Her fingers refused to work properly on the buttons of her tunic. She heard, on the other side of the screen, the quiet sound of water running, and the small, wet slap of the doctor washing her hands in an enamel basin. She heard the doctor speaking to the nurse in English, in tones too low to make out, but the cadence was the cadence of two professionals discussing a case, not the cadence of two predators discussing prey. Greta finished undressing. She wrapped her arms around herself. She stepped out from behind the screen wearing only her thin gray service-issue undergarments, and she walked to the examination table with her eyes fixed on a small, framed photograph above the doctor's desk. The photograph showed a young man in an American uniform, smiling at the camera. Captain Doyle would later tell her, much later, in a letter that arrived in Dresden in 1949, that the young man was her son, and that he had been killed in the Pacific in November of 1944, 6 months before Greta's examination, and that she had decided to keep working not because the work eased her grief, but because it was the only thing that still made sense. But Greta did not know any of that yet. She only saw the photograph. She climbed onto the table. The doctor approached and spoke to her gently in that careful, accented German. She explained what she was going to do, step by step, before she did it. She listened to Greta's heart with a stethoscope, the metal warm against her sternum because the doctor had held it in her hand to warm it first. She looked into Greta's eyes with a small light. She palpated her neck and her abdomen with steady, professional fingers. She asked about her menstrual cycle, when her last period had been, whether she had ever been pregnant, whether she had ever had any venereal disease, whether she had ever been forced into sexual contact against her will. The questions were asked the way a teacher asks a child to recite the multiplication tables, neither prurient nor accusing, simply as items on a list. Greta answered as best she could. Her last period had been irregular for months because of stress and poor nutrition. She had never been pregnant. She had never had any disease that she knew of. She had never been forced. The doctor wrote each answer down. She nodded. She said, "Now I have to do the internal examination. This is to check for venereal infection and for any abnormality of the reproductive organs. Many women in the auxiliary services have been infected by their officers or in field hospitals, even without their knowledge. We need to know if you have any infection, because if you do, we will treat it now with penicillin, which we have in quantity. Do you understand? Do you have any questions before I begin?" Greta could not speak. She shook her head. The doctor nodded once more, and she did exactly what she said she would do, and nothing more and nothing less. She used a speculum, warmed in a basin of water. She used her gloved fingers, slowly and gently, with the chaperone nurse standing at the head of the table with one hand resting lightly on Greta's shoulder. She narrated in a soft voice everything she found, and the nurse wrote it down. The examination lasted perhaps 4 minutes. When it was over, the doctor stepped back, removed her gloves, dropped them into a metal bucket, and washed her hands again. She said, "You may dress now. There is no sign of infection. There is no sign of pregnancy. You are underweight, and your menstrual cycle has stopped because of malnutrition, but this will correct itself once you are eating properly. You have a small infection in your left ear that I will treat with sulfa powder. You also have lice in your hair, which we will treat with a delousing agent in the next room. None of this is your fault. None of this is anything to be ashamed of. You may dress now." And then she did something that Greta would remember for the rest of her life, longer than she remembered her own wedding, longer than she remembered the birth of her own daughter. The doctor offered her a hand to help her sit up. Just that. A small, ordinary, human gesture. A hand extended across an examination table from a victor to one of the vanquished. And Greta took the hand, because there was nothing else to do, and she sat up, and she discovered that she was crying without having known she had begun. And the doctor said, in the same calm voice as before, "I am sorry that the people who sent you here told you to expect something else. I have heard what they told you. It was never going to be that way. Not in this army, not in this room." And Greta walked out of that examination room in a state of total disorientation, because everything she had built her 2 years of dread upon had just been quietly dismantled in less than an hour by a woman in a white coat who had warmed a stethoscope in her hand before placing it on her chest. What happened in the next room continued the disassembly. Greta was taken by a nurse to a small chamber where her hair was washed in a basin of warm water with a stinging chemical that killed the lice in her scalp. The nurse worked carefully and apologized when the chemical burned her eyes. She was given a thin towel and told to wrap her hair, and then she was led to a third room where she was issued clean clothing, a simple cotton dress, a wool cardigan, 2 changes of underclothes, a pair of warm stockings, a pair of leather shoes that almost fit her. The clothes had been donated, the interpreter explained, by American women's charitable organizations, the American Red Cross, the Lutheran Women's League of Wisconsin, the Catholic Daughters of America. Greta looked at the small white label sewn inside the collar of the dress, where a previous owner had embroidered her own initials. M.E.K. She wondered who M.E.K. was and whether she knew that her dress was now being worn by a German prisoner in a converted schoolhouse in Bavaria, and what she would say if she did know. Greta would wonder this for the rest of her life. After dressing, she was given a small enamel cup of broth, hot and salty and faintly oily, with shredded chicken floating in it, and a slice of white bread. White bread. She had not seen white bread in 3 years. She sat on a wooden bench and held the cup in both hands and lifted it to her mouth, and the heat of it was so kind and so undeserved that she found herself crying again, more quietly this time, the tears running into the broth and salting it further. The other women emerged one by one from the examination corridor. They came in pieces. Some came out as Greta had, dazed, undone, unable to speak. Some came out laughing in a way that was not really laughter, but the body's response to terror that had not happened. One woman, a girl of 20 named Annalise, who had been a clerk in a Luftwaffe paymaster's office, came out and immediately sat down on the floor in the middle of the room because her legs would not hold her. A nurse helped her up. A young woman, perhaps the youngest of them, a 16-year-old named Brigitte, who had been pressed into service 3 months earlier as part of the Volkssturm levy of teenage girls, came out and immediately ran to the corner of the room and was sick on the floor. A nurse cleaned it up without complaint. A doctor came in, a different doctor this time, an older man with a kind face and a thin mustache, and spoke to Brigitte gently in German and asked if she would prefer to sleep before her further processing. Brigitte nodded. He arranged for her to be taken to a cot in a quiet room. And throughout all of this, the women who were waiting their turn watched and saw and slowly began to revise the story they had been told. By mid-afternoon, the examinations were complete. The 23 German women sat at a long wooden table in a large room that had once been the schoolhouse's main classroom, and they ate a hot meal of beef stew and boiled potatoes and a strange yellow vegetable called corn, which most of them had never seen before, and they drank weak coffee that was, nevertheless, real coffee, with sugar, and they listened as Captain Doyle and the interpreter explained what would happen next. They would be transported in a few days to a more permanent facility, a women's prisoner of war camp at a place called Münsingen, where they would remain until the war ended. They would be allowed to write letters to their families through the International Red Cross, although they should not expect quick replies given the disruption of the German postal system. They would be given regular medical care. They would be fed 3 meals a day. They would be paid a small wage, in camp scrip, for any work they performed, which would be voluntary and would not exceed reasonable hours. They would not be harmed. They would not be sexually exploited. They would not be photographed for propaganda. If any American soldier behaved improperly toward any of them at any time, they were to report it immediately to the camp commandant, and the soldier would be punished under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which Captain Doyle explained with a small, dry smile, applied equally to Americans regardless of who their alleged victims were. "We did not fight this war," Captain Doyle said through the interpreter, "to become the people we fought. The men who told you what we would do, they were telling you about themselves. They were telling you what they would have done if our positions had been reversed. They were not telling you the truth about us. I am sorry that you have spent 2 years afraid. The fear was not necessary. The fear was a lie. You are safe here. You will remain safe. That is a promise from the United States Army." Greta wrote those words down in a small notebook she had been given along with her dress and her shoes. She wrote them in German, in her careful, schoolgirl handwriting. She underlined the sentence about the fear being a lie. She would carry that notebook with her for the next 62 years of her life. It would survive her transfer to Münzingen. It would survive the end of the war. It would survive her repatriation to Dresden in the autumn of 1945, to find her mother alive but her father dead, her family apartment a smoking ruin, her city a graveyard of stones. It would survive the Soviet occupation, the establishment of the German Democratic Republic, the construction of the Berlin Wall, her own marriage in 1953, the birth of her daughter in 1957, the death of her husband in 1981, the fall of the wall in 1989, the reunification of Germany in 1990, and her own slow decline into the small apartment in Dresden, where she would die in 2007, 2 months before her 85th birthday. And when her daughter cleaned out her mother's apartment, she would find the notebook in the bottom drawer of an old oak dresser, beneath a stack of folded handkerchiefs, and she would open it, and she would read in her mother's young, careful hand the underlined sentence. The fear was a lie, and she would not understand what it meant, but she would keep the notebook. She would keep it because something in her mother's handwriting told her it mattered. There were more stories from that schoolhouse. There were always more stories. Ilse Kruger, the anti-aircraft auxiliary who had been first through the door, would later testify in a 1986 oral history interview recorded by a German university researcher that the examination had been the moment her ideological commitment to the Nazi regime had quietly died inside her. "I had believed," she said, "for so many years that the Americans were animals. I had believed it the way one believes that water is wet. And then a woman who could have hated me, who had every reason to hate me, washed her hands before she touched me and apologized when she had to cause me even small discomfort. I sat in the examination room afterward, and I understood in a single moment that everything I had been told for 10 years was the opposite of true. Everything, not most of it, all of it. The whole structure collapsed in 1 hour. I was 29 years old, and I had to begin learning the world over again from the beginning, like a child." Helga Müller, who had served beside Ilse in the same anti-aircraft battery, would tell her granddaughter in 1993 that the food they were served that first afternoon had been impossible to swallow at first. "I sat with the spoon in my hand," she said, "and the stew was right in front of me, steaming, smelling of meat and onions and butter, and I could not lift it to my mouth, because to eat it would be to admit that the Americans were not what I had been told they were. And if they were not what I had been told they were, then everything else I had been told was also in question. The Eastern Front, the bombing campaign, the camps, the Jews, everything. And I was not ready, in that hour, to lose everything I had believed in. So I sat with the spoon, and I looked at the stew, and I cried. And finally, an American nurse sat down next to me on the bench, and she did not say anything, and she did not push me, and after a while she just took up her own spoon and ate her own meal beside me, and her companionship, her silence, her willingness to sit with me while I was breaking, made it possible at last for me to eat. I do not know her name. I never knew her name. But she sat with me while my world ended, and she did not say a single word, and she is in my prayers every night, 68 years later. Anneliese Vogel, the clerk who had collapsed on the floor, would marry an American soldier in 1947 after she had been repatriated and after he had come back to Bavaria looking for her, and they would live together in Cleveland, Ohio, for 41 years before his death in 1988. She would tell her 4 American children that their father had not been her enemy, but her rescuer, although not in the way that phrase usually meant. He had not pulled her from a burning building. He had pulled her, slowly and patiently, from the burning building inside her own head, and the foundation of that building had been laid in a converted schoolhouse in Bavaria on the 11th of April, 1945, when a woman in a white coat had warmed a stethoscope in her hand. Brigitte Wagner, the 16-year-old who had been sick in the corner, would never speak of the day at all. She would return to her small village outside Stuttgart, marry a local baker, raise 3 sons, and live a quiet life in which the war was a closed door she did not open. But on her death in 2011, at the age of 82, her sons would find among her papers a single yellowed sheet, folded into eighths, written in pencil, dated April 1945. It would read, in its entirety, "Today an American doctor was kind to me. I thought I would die today. I am alive instead. I do not know what to do with this. I am writing it down so that I will remember it, in case I forget." Her sons would not know what to make of the sheet. They would frame it, eventually, and hang it in the bakery their family still owned. It hangs there to this day. Most of the customers do not ask about it. The ones who do are told the simple truth, which is that no one in the family is entirely sure what it means, only that the woman who wrote it never threw it away, and that whatever happened on that day in 1945 was important enough to be remembered by a 16-year-old in pencil and important enough to be kept by an 82-year-old for the rest of her life. This was not an isolated camp. This was not an isolated set of doctors. The procedures Greta and the others experienced on the 11th of April 1945 were the product of a deliberate American medical and military policy that had been refined over almost 3 years of practice. By the time of Greta's examination, the United States Army Medical Corps had developed standardized procedures for the medical processing of female prisoners and displaced persons, codified in field manuals and inspection protocols that drew directly from the 1929 Geneva Convention, but that, in many places, went substantially beyond what the convention strictly required. The protocols required separate processing facilities for women, where possible. They required female medical personnel, where possible. They required female chaperones in all examinations, without exception. They required that the purpose of each procedure be explained in advance, in the woman's own language, by an interpreter who was, where possible, also female. They required that prisoners be given the right to refuse non-essential procedures and to register complaints through Red Cross representatives who visited the camps quarterly. They required, perhaps most importantly, that examinations be conducted in private, behind closed doors, with no photographs taken, no observers present, and no record kept of any information that was not strictly medical. The contrast with the German procedures that Greta had been warned about, the procedures that had been described in such detail by the political officers, the public stripping, the photographs, the leering committees of officers, was not accidental. The American protocols had been designed very deliberately by physicians and nurses and military lawyers in Washington and at Walter Reed and at the Surgeon General's office, with the explicit goal of producing the opposite outcome. They had been designed to communicate, through the structure of the procedure itself, that the United States considered each woman who entered its custody, regardless of her uniform, her nationality, or her affiliation with the regime she had served, to be a human being whose dignity was not forfeit. The American Army did not always live up to these protocols. There were failures. There were violations. There were individual soldiers who behaved badly, and who, in some cases, were prosecuted, and in other cases, were not. The historical record, as it has been opened over the last several decades through the declassification of military medical archives, is not the record of a perfect institution. But it is, on balance, the record of an institution that tried, and that mostly succeeded, in treating female prisoners according to a standard of medical care that was, for many of them, higher than any standard they had experienced as free women in the Reich they had served. This last fact, which is well documented in the medical files preserved at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, in record groups 112 and 247, was perhaps the most disorienting truth of all for the women who experienced it. Many of them, like Greta, had never had a proper medical examination in their lives before they were captured. Healthcare under the Nazi regime had been heavily ideological and increasingly impoverished as the war ground on. Women's reproductive health, in particular, had been treated as a state concern rather than a personal one. Greta's only prior gynecological examination had been a single perfunctory inspection at the time of her induction into the Helferinnen, conducted in a row of curtained cubicles by an army physician who had spoken not one word to her and who had performed his examination so brusquely that she had bled lightly for 2 days afterward. She had assumed this was normal. She had assumed all examinations were like that. She had not known that examinations could be done any other way. Captain Doyle, on that morning in April, had taught her that examinations could be done another way, and that single, small, professional kindness, the warmed stethoscope, the explained procedure, the apology, the offered hand, had constituted, for Greta Hoffmann, the first medical examination of her life in which she had been treated as a patient rather than as an object. She did not realize this at the time. She would not realize it for several years. But once she did realize it, the realization would never leave her. Münzingen, where Greta and the others were transferred 2 days after their initial processing, was one of several camps in southern Germany designated specifically for female prisoners of war. It held, by the late spring of 1945, approximately 1,400 German women, a mixture of Helferinnen from various branches of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, civilian women who had served the regime in administrative capacities, a small number of female SS auxiliaries who were held in a separate compound under stricter conditions, and a handful of women whose status was unclear and who were being held pending further investigation. The camp was not, by the standards of the war, harsh. Greta was housed in a wooden barracks building with 35 other women. The bunks were stacked 3 high. The mattresses were thin but clean. The blankets were American Army-issue wool, scratchy and warm and abundant. Each woman was issued 2 sets of clothing, 2 pairs of underclothes, 2 pairs of stockings, a pair of shoes, a coat, a hat, a comb, a toothbrush, a small tin of tooth powder, a bar of soap, a small towel, and a metal mess kit. The barracks had electric light, fed by a generator that ran from sunset until 10 o'clock at night, and a wood stove at each end that the women fed themselves with cordwood delivered every morning. Meals were served 3 times a day in a large mess hall. The food was monotonous, the same heavy American Army rations that the soldiers ate, but it was abundant, and it contained more calories than any of the women had consumed daily in years. Greta gained 6 kilograms in the first month of her captivity. So did most of the others. The women looked at themselves in small hand mirrors that the camp administration had provided, and they did not recognize the women they saw, because the women they saw had color in their cheeks and fat under their skin and hair that was clean and curled at the ends, and they had not seen those women in the mirror for so long that they had forgotten what they looked like. Medical care continued. A small clinic operated out of one corner of the camp, staffed by a rotating team of American nurses and one Army physician, Captain Doyle's colleague, a man named Major Henry Lubowski, who had been a general practitioner in Brooklyn before the war, and who spoke a serviceable Yiddish that allowed him to communicate with effort in something resembling German. Major Lubowski was Jewish. Greta did not know what to do with this fact when she learned it. She had been told her entire adult life that Jews were the enemy of the German people, and now a Jewish doctor was treating her ear infection with sulfa powder twice a week and asking her, in his accented German, how her appetite was and whether her menstrual cycle had returned to normal yet. She would later say, in an interview given to the same German university researcher who had recorded Ilse Kruger, that Major Lubowski's gentleness had been, in some ways, even more disorienting than Captain Doyle's, because she could find no possible motive for it. Captain Doyle, after all, was a woman, and one could imagine that she felt some sympathy across national lines based on shared experience. But Major Lubowski had every reason in the world to hate the women he was treating. He must have known, by April 1945, what had been done to his people. He must have read the same reports that had begun reaching the American public that month, the reports from Ohrdruf and Buchenwald, and the smaller camps that the Americans had liberated as they swept east. And yet he came every Tuesday and every Friday, and he washed his hands, and he treated his patients with steady, professional, almost gentle care, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not speak of the war, and he did not ask anyone to apologize for anything, and he simply did his work. Greta asked him once in halting words, why? Why he treated them, why he did not hate them. He had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had said in his accented German, "Because I am a doctor, because if I become someone who refuses to treat patients, I have become someone I do not wish to be. The people who did what was done to my family, they refused to treat patients. They refused to treat people as patients at all. They refused to treat people as people. I will not be that. Not ever. Not even now." And then he had gone back to writing in his notebook, and he had not spoken of it again. Greta would think about that answer for the rest of her life. She would think about it on the day she stood at her father's grave in 1946. She would think about it on the day she signed the papers to join the East German State Bureau of Telecommunications in 1951. She would think about it on the day the Stasi officer came to her flat in 1973 and asked her to inform on her neighbor, and she said no, and waited for the consequences that did not, in the end, come. She would think about it on the day the wall fell in 1989, and she went out into the streets of Dresden with her grown daughter and her small granddaughter, and she watched the city she had been born into in 1923 enter, for the third time in her life, an entirely new political reality. And every time she thought about Major Lubowski's answer, she thought about it the same way. He had not let what was done to him decide what he would do to others. He had decided that for himself. The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May, 1945, less than a month after Greta's initial examination at the schoolhouse in Bavaria. The news reached Münzingen at midday on a warm spring afternoon. The camp commandant assembled the prisoners in the main yard and made a brief announcement through an interpreter. The German government had signed an unconditional surrender. The war on the European continent was over. Repatriation procedures would begin shortly, but they would take time because the chaos of post-war Europe was extreme, and the displaced persons numbered in the millions, and the trains were broken, and the bridges were down, and the roads were full of refugees moving in every direction at once. The women would be returned to their homes as quickly as it could be arranged. In the meantime, they should remain calm, continue to follow camp procedures, and write to their families through the Red Cross to begin establishing where exactly their homes now were. The yard was silent for a long moment after the announcement. Then, slowly, a sound began to rise from the assembled women. It was not cheering. It was something more complicated. It was the sound of 1,400 women releasing all at once a breath they had been holding for years. Some of them wept. Some of them sat down on the ground. Some of them embraced. A few of them began to sing, very quietly, an old German folk song about coming home, the kind of song that does not belong to any political regime, but only to the simple, persistent longing of people who have been away. The song spread through the yard slowly. Greta did not sing. She stood very still, and she looked up at the sky over the camp, which was a clean blue with a few small white clouds, and she thought about her brother, and her father, and her mother, and Dresden, and she felt, for the first time in many years, a small and very fragile permission to begin imagining a future. Her repatriation took until October. She was held at Münsingen through the summer while the bureaucratic machinery of denazification slowly catalogued each woman, certified her background, established whether she had been involved in any criminal activity, cleared her for release. Greta was cleared without difficulty. She had been a radio operator. She had touched no weapon. She had given no order. She had committed no crime that the Allies could find. She was given a small certificate of release, a single ticket on a train that would carry her north, a small bundle of clothing and a Red Cross food parcel for the journey, and the address of a Red Cross station in Dresden, where she could register her presence and begin to look for her surviving family. She left Münsingen on the 17th of October, 1945, on a cold, gray morning. As she walked out of the gate, she turned and looked back at the camp. She saw the wooden barracks. She saw the wire fence. She saw the watchtowers, manned now by bored young American soldiers who waved at the departing women with a kind of distracted friendliness. She saw in the distance the small, low building of the clinic where Major Lubowski had treated her ear, and where, the week before, Captain Doyle herself had visited as part of a final medical inspection and had pronounced Greta well enough to travel. Greta had not known what to say to Captain Doyle in their final meeting. She had wanted to say everything, and she had been able to say almost nothing. In the end, she had said only, "Thank you, for the first day, for the schoolhouse." And Captain Doyle, who had remembered her, had nodded and had said, in her careful German, "I am glad you were not hurt. I am glad you are going home. Take care of yourself, Fräulein Hoffmann. Be well." And then she had moved on to the next woman in the line, because there were always more women in the line, and there was always more work to do. Greta carried her bundle and her certificate and her notebook, and she boarded the train and she went home. Dresden, when she returned to it, was not a city. It was a memory of a city. The center, where her family's apartment had stood, was a moonscape of broken stone. The smell of dust and old smoke and something worse, something underneath the dust, hung over everything. The streetcar lines were twisted upward from the cobblestones like the bones of some enormous animal that had been killed and left to rot in the sun. Her mother, when Greta finally found her, was living in a single room in a partially intact building on the outskirts of the city, sharing the room with 3 other women and a small boy who was the orphaned grandson of one of them. Her mother had aged 20 years in the 3 years Greta had been away. Her hair was entirely white. Her hands shook constantly. Her father had been killed in the firestorm of February 1945, along with 30,000 or more other Dresdeners, in a single night of bombing that had hollowed out the city Greta had been born in. Her mother could speak of him only briefly before her voice would fail. Greta did not press. She moved into the small room. She got a job eventually, with the post office, sorting mail, and then later with the East German State Telecommunications Service, putting her old wartime skills to a new use in a country that was reorganizing itself brutally and slowly under Soviet supervision. She did not speak in those first years about the camp. She did not speak about Captain Doyle, or Major Lubowski, or the schoolhouse, or the warmed stethoscope, or the apology. She kept the notebook in her drawer. She read it sometimes at night when her mother was asleep. She did not show it to anyone. The reason she did not show it, she would later explain to her daughter in the only conversation they ever had about it, was that no one in post-war Germany wanted to hear that the Americans had been kind. The Soviets were now the official liberators in the East. The Americans were the new enemy, the imperialists, the warmongers, the architects of West German revanchism. To speak well of an American doctor in Dresden in 1948 was to invite a visit from men in dark coats. And later, even after Stalin's death, even after the relative softening of the East German regime in the 1960s and 70s, there was a deeper silence at work. To speak of the kindness of the Americans was, for a woman like Greta, to admit how completely she had been deceived by the regime that had sent her to war, to admit that she had spent 2 years afraid of the wrong things, to admit that the people she had been told were monsters had warmed a stethoscope in their hands and washed them before touching her and apologized when they had to cause her even small discomfort. It was easier to be silent. Most of the women Greta had been imprisoned with were silent for the same reason. They came home and they went on with their lives, and they buried what had happened in the converted schoolhouse beneath the daily work of rebuilding a country that had reduced itself to rubble. Some of them, like Brigitte Wagner, never spoke of it at all. Some of them, like Anneliese Vogel, escaped Germany entirely and made new lives in America, which made it easier in some ways and harder in others. Some of them, like Ilse Kruger and Helga Müller, eventually spoke of it in old age to researchers who came knocking on their doors with tape recorders and gentle questions in the 1980s and 1990s, when the world had finally become curious about what had really happened in those last weeks of the war, when the great machinery of the Reich was breaking, and the women who had served inside that machinery were being processed, one, by an enemy who turned out not to be what they had been told. The historical record has been slow in coming together because so much was kept silent for so long. The medical files exist, archived in cardboard boxes at College Park, browned at the edges, the carbon copies of the carbons of the examinations that were performed on hundreds of thousands of women in the spring and summer of 1945. The oral histories exist, in university archives in Germany and the United States, recorded one woman at a time, often only at the very end of their lives. The letters exist, preserved in the personal papers of the doctors and nurses themselves, who came home and went on with their own lives, but who often, in retirement, looked back at those months and wrote about them with a kind of bewildered pride. Captain Margaret Doyle, who served until November 1945, returned to her medical practice in upstate New York, never remarried, never had more children to replace the son who had been killed in the Pacific, and died in 1979 at the age of 79. Her papers, donated to a small historical society in Albany, include several hundred handwritten notes on individual examinations conducted in the spring of 1945. Greta Hoffmann's examination is recorded in 2 sentences on a yellowed index card filed alphabetically under H. The card reads, Hoffmann Greta, 22 years old, Luftwaffe HLF, Dresden. Underweight, mild otitis sin, no VD, no pregimage, menses irreg D/T malnutrition. Pleasant, frightened, spoke kindly. She seemed to need it. 5 small words at the end of a clinical note, written by a woman who had buried her own son 5 months earlier, about a frightened girl from a country that had killed him. 5 words that, when Greta's daughter finally found them, in 2009, 2 years after her mother's death, having tracked Captain Doyle's papers down through a slow chain of letters and inquiries, sat down in the reading room of the Historical Society in Albany and wept for an hour at a small wooden table, while a librarian quietly placed a box of tissues beside her elbow and walked away. She seemed to need it, so the woman in the white coat had given it to her. That was the entire history, compressed into a sentence. A frightened girl had needed kindness, and someone with the power to refuse had given it instead. This is the story of one woman in one corridor on one morning in April 1945. But it is also the story of tens of thousands of women in dozens of camps, processed by hundreds of doctors and thousands of nurses, who entered American custody expecting the worst and encountered instead something they could not have prepared themselves to encounter. A medical system that took its own ethics seriously, a profession that refused to be corrupted by the war it was fighting. An army that, despite its many flaws, had decided, somewhere in the planning offices of Washington in 1942 and 1943, that the way it treated its prisoners would be a measure of what it was fighting for, and that this measure would not be allowed to slip even when the temptation was enormous, and the moral cost of refusing was nothing more than the inconvenience of building a few more wooden screens, training a few more female nurses, warming a few thousand stethoscopes in a few thousand gloved hands. The women who experienced this did not always know what to make of it. Many of them, like Greta, were unable to speak of it for decades because the truth of it was too difficult to fit into the political categories available to them after the war. To say that the American doctors were kind was, in the East, to be politically suspect. To say that the German propaganda had been lies was, in the West, in the immediate post-war period, often unwelcome, because so many West Germans were trying very hard to suggest that they had not believed the propaganda in the first place, and the testimony of women who had clearly believed it and had been undone by their experience of its falsehood did not fit the story that post-war West Germany was trying to tell about itself. So the women were largely silent, and the doctors and nurses were largely silent too, because they had come home from the war and they had their own lives to rebuild, and they did not, by and large, think of themselves as having done anything particularly remarkable. They had washed their hands, they had warmed their stethoscopes, they had explained their procedures, they had apologized when they caused pain, they had said, "You may dress now." They had been, in their own minds, simply competent professionals doing the work they had been trained to do. The fact that this competence had constituted, for many of the women they treated, a revelation that overturned an entire ideology was not something the doctors and nurses themselves usually understood. They did not understand it because, from their side, kindness in a medical context was simply normal. From the German women's side, kindness in any context from anyone in authority was so abnormal that it functioned as a kind of explosion. Two different normalities collided in those examination rooms in the spring of 1945, and one of them won, and the other one quietly went home and did not, for the most part, ever speak of it again. But it was not nothing, that quiet victory. It was not nothing for Ilse Kruger, who learned to see the world differently in a single hour. It was not nothing for Helga Müller, who ate her first meal beside a silent nurse who would not abandon her while her ideology died. It was not nothing for Anneliese Vogel, who married into the country that had pulled her, slowly, from the burning building inside her head. It was not nothing for Brigitte Wagner, who folded a yellowed sheet of penciled paper into eighths and kept it for 66 years because it was the day she had been kind to by an enemy. And it was not nothing for Greta Hoffmann of Dresden, 22 years old in April 1945, who walked through a door expecting the end of dignity and walked out, an hour later, in a clean cotton dress with an embroidered initial inside the collar, holding the hand of a woman in a white coat who had lost her son 6 months earlier and who had decided, despite that loss, to keep being kind to people because being kind to people was what she did. The fear was a lie. Greta had written it down. She had underlined it. She had kept the notebook in the bottom of a drawer for 62 years. And when her granddaughter, eventually, in 2014, would track down the story behind the notebook and would discover the index card in Albany and would visit Münzingen as part of a school project on the immediate post-war period, she would understand, finally, what her grandmother had been trying to say. The fear was a lie. The lie had been told for years, and the lie had nearly cost a generation of women their lives, because some of them had been so afraid of the lie that they had killed themselves rather than be captured. And the lie had been undone, one woman at a time, by other women in white coats, who had simply done their jobs with the care that their jobs deserved. This is the part of the war that does not get told often. The artillery gets told. The tank battles get told. The flag raisings and the surrenders and the famous speeches all get told. The mass crimes get told, rightly, because they must be told, because the world must remember. But there is another story that runs alongside all of these, quieter and steadier and more humane, and it is the story of how, in the worst war humanity has ever inflicted on itself, there were people who refused to become the war. There were people who, in the small rooms behind closed doors, in the converted schoolhouses and the hastily erected clinics and the canvas-walled examination tents, kept doing their work the way their work was supposed to be done. They warmed stethoscopes. They washed their hands. They explained what they were about to do before they did it. They apologized when they had to cause pain. They offered hands across examination tables. They said, "You may dress now." They said, "I am sorry that you have spent 2 years afraid." They said, "The fear was a lie." They said, "We did not fight this war to become the people we fought." And the women who were on the receiving end of those small professional kindnesses heard them and remembered them and carried them home and kept them, often in silence, often for the rest of their lives. Some of those women died still believing the lies they had been told as girls. Most of them did not. Most of them, in the quiet of their own thoughts, understood what had happened to them in those examination rooms, and they understood it for the rest of their lives. They had been told that the enemy would shame them, and the enemy had instead handed them clean cotton dresses with embroidered initials inside the collars and warm bowls of broth with shredded chicken in them. They had been told that the enemy would strip their dignity, and the enemy had instead asked, before each procedure, whether they understood and whether they had any questions. They had been told that the enemy would treat them like animals, and the enemy had instead, in the cleanest small rooms many of them had ever been in, treated them as patients, as women whose bodies were worth caring for and whose minds were worth speaking to and whose questions were worth answering. The ideology of the regime they had served had told them, for 12 years, that some lives were worth more than others, that some people were people and others were not, that the war they were fighting was a war to determine which kinds of human beings deserved to survive into the future. And then they had walked into a corridor in southern Bavaria, expecting the absolute logical consequence of that ideology to be done to them by an enemy that had, by every right and every reasonable expectation, every excuse to do it. And the enemy had refused. The enemy had simply, quietly, professionally refused. The enemy had handed them dresses and warmed stethoscopes and said the war did not need to be fought that way. The war could be fought differently. The war, in fact, had always been about the difference. That was the part the regime had not told them. That was the part Greta Hoffmann learned in 1 hour in a schoolhouse in Bavaria. That was the part she carried in a notebook for 62 years. That was the part her granddaughter would visit Münzingen in 2014 to try to understand. And that is the part I want to leave you with today, 81 years after a young woman from Dresden walked through a door expecting her dignity to end, and walked out instead holding a hand. We remember the great battles because the great battles are easy to remember. We remember the famous generals because the famous generals had their names carved into stone. But the women in white coats, the nurses with clipboards, the Major Lebowskis and the Captain Doyles did not have their names carved into stone. They had their names typed onto carbon paper duplicates of medical reports filed in cardboard boxes in archives in Maryland. They had their initials embroidered into the collars of donated dresses. They had their gentleness recorded in the underlined sentences of small notebooks kept in the bottom drawers of oak dressers in old apartments in Dresden for 62 years, until a daughter cleaning out her mother's possessions finally opened the notebook and read the words. The fear was a lie. That sentence, more than any other sentence that came out of the Second World War, deserves to be remembered. The fear was a lie. And the kindness, despite everything the world had done to deserve it, was real. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the war in a way you have not thought about it before, please take a moment to like this video so that more people can find it. Subscribe to the channel and tap the bell so that you do not miss the next forgotten chapter of history. And please leave a comment below, telling me what part of Greta's story stayed with you, and whether you have heard stories like this from your own family, your own grandparents, your own great-grandparents who lived through those years and who carried home, in their notebooks or their silences, the small kindnesses that history almost forgot. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And until the next story, take care of each other. Be kind when you do not have to be. Warm the stethoscope in your hand before you place it on someone's chest. The fear is almost always a lie. The kindness is what is real. And it is what we will be remembered for in the end, long after the battles have faded and the politics have changed and the generations have turned. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.